Okay, so good to see you. Thank you for all of you brave people who ventured out in these dire conditions to be here tonight. This was an idea from Bill, who said, you know, we have a lot of problems with the way that Israel's portrayed, and in the last war, it was a real nightmare. And in terms of how Israel was perceived and how Israel lost the media war and the social war in the United States and probably all over the world, but Israel doesn't expect a fair shake in most of the world. I mean, in Europe, it's so biased against Israel in almost every place that you don't really even expect it to be fair. In the Arab world, I mean, come on. But at least in the United States, you would hope that it would be unbiased and you could get a general understanding of what's actually going on in Israel. And we saw that this last war was more of in America, a social media phenomenon. And you saw that there were some celebrities who were anti-Israel who have more followers on social media than there are Jews in the world. Many times over. 40, 50 million followers of some of these people who don't know really the first thing about what's going on in Israel and couldn't fill more than one meme of space with any intelligent information about what's going on in Israel. And, you know, to think that you could follow this topic, which is so complex, which you need almost a PhD to understand, just by information that you get off Twitter, is, you know, pure folly. So what I want to do today, and welcome to everybody who's watching at home, and again, thank you for all of you who were so brave, you know, to come out in, you know, this war-torn environment. So what we're going to try to do is address where the problems are with regard to diplomacy, why Israel seems to always get a bad rap, and how Israel's detractors have been so successful at really getting the ball rolling to the point where they've made anti-Israel sentiment a top agenda item of so many people who in the past it wasn't really even their issue. So what I'm going to do is address 6 areas of concern. I'll read them all. And then anything else, and then we'll have time for questions. So whatever I leave out, you'll pick up on, and then we can discuss. Feel free to make any comment or so forth. However, if you speak and you want the people at home to hear you, you have to use the mic. Otherwise, they won't hear you, and then I'll get all the complaints that they couldn't hear the other people. And even though I'll try to convince them, it's not worth your time. You only need to hear me. They still get annoyed, as if they're missing something. Although, conceivably, this isn't Torah. This is stuff we all know. So maybe I have something good. We'll see. The gauntlet has been thrown down. Okay, so if you want to speak, I'll just leave this right here. Feel free to come and take. Okay, so let's begin. Now, what are my main topics? First of all, we need to talk about what is Palestine. What is the word? What is the name? What does it mean? Where does it come from? Who is a Palestinian? What's going on in the Temple Mount? Why do the Palestinians continue to teach that Jews want to destroy the mosque on top of the Temple Mount? And why have they been teaching that since the 1920s? Right? What's the deal with the settlements? What's BDS? And this is obviously a big topic. What's going on in Gaza? And finally, the American progressives. And then I have here J Street and Jews. Why do so many Jews seem to be anti-Israel? So there's two ways of talking about this. There's two ways of talking about this. One is looking at the lens of since Obama took office, since President Obama took office. And the other is going back maybe since the time of King Solomon. So we have to weigh those two. Okay. Now, why do I say that? Because over the last 12 years, Israel has become a partisan issue in the United States. This is something that people like me who are very involved with AIPAC try to fight against with all our might. It's desperately important that Israel remains a bipartisan issue. And to have now this illusion, or whether it's real or not, or this perception that the Republicans are the pro-Israel side and the Democrats are the anti-Israel side, is horrible for Israel. We need both sides supporting Israel all the time. But what happened was, Obama and Netanyahu famously did not get along. And it got ugly. It got ugly to the point that Prime Minister Netanyahu came to Congress at the request of Speaker Boehner and addressed the bicameral houses of Congress. Now, Obama didn't invite him, and he was very offended, and Nancy Pelosi was crying, and it was very tough for her, and so forth. Hopefully she got over it. Well, that intensified the rift between Obama and Netanyahu. And when Trump started to campaign, well, first of all, Netanyahu came out on the side of Romney in Obama's second election. It was a huge mistake. Why is it a huge mistake? Well, first thing is Romney lost. So if you bet on the losing guy, that's not good. But even if he would have won, Netanyahu still made a lot of enemies on the Democratic side. And what happened was, then, by the time Trump won, Trump was so close with Netanyahu and so heavily favored for Israel that imagine what was going on in the Democratic Party. First of all, we already don't like Netanyahu. Second of all, we hate anything that Trump likes. That's just our default position. That's who we are. He's horrible on everything. And then they realized, oh my goodness, we have a problem. Because we hate Trump on everything, but we kind of agree with him on Israel, sort of. And even if we don't, the people that we ask for money do. At least the Jewish ones. And so that became a real problem. And so a lot of the tension that is here on the left and the progressives that has risen in the last 12 months is because anything that's pro-Trump is bad if you're a progressive. And what it looks like is that Trump supports the Goliath in Israel, and the Palestinians are the innocent Davids being trampled on, and those are the kinds of people that Trump likes to step on, like Mexicans, like, whoever. That's how Trump is. And it got played up and played up and played up until this new perception has arisen in the social media generation that Israel's the bad guy and the Palestinians are the innocent underdogs. Just like when I was growing up, I was taught correctly, but in a totally different way, that the whites in South Africa were evil and that the blacks were being trampled on. And in that case, where that really was what we called apartheid, in fact, the whites admitted that it was an apartheid regime, and they really were white supremacists. In Israel, that's absurd. But that's what's happened. And there's this mindset that's been created on the progressive left that really began with President Obama. Now, I'm not saying him so much per se, although I think to some extent he probably did believe this. that the Israelis are the white colonialists and the Palestinians are the dark-skinned natives. What's amazing about that theory is that less than 50% of Israelis are white. The majority of Israelis are not Caucasian. The majority of Israelis are Sephardic, Mediterranean, Ethiopian. And the minority is Caucasian. So, on its face, it's a pretty amazing statement. How do you go to Israel, look a Ethiopian Jew, and tell him you're a white colonialist? But this is a thing. How do you tell a Jew whose family was kicked out of Syria, or Turkey, or Yemen, or Iraq, or Iran, or Jordan, or Egypt, or Morocco, and say, you're a white colonialist? So the people you saying are the white colonialists are the ones who came to Israel from Europe with numbers on their arms. So, okay, if you don't want to tell the Ethiopians that they're the white colonialists, and you're not going to tell the ones who were kicked out of their homes in Syria that they're white colonialists, you're going to go tell the Holocaust survivors that they're white colonialists? And if you're not going to tell them, who's left? 12 guys from Brooklyn. I mean, that's it. That's Israel. So, but it doesn't matter. If Instagram says Netanyahu's the white guy and the guys in Gaza are the downtrodden, similar to African Americans in the United States, and Netanyahu speaks English better than anyone in this country, he's a white colonialist. And that's kind of what's happened. Okay, so that's what it looks like if we're dealing with this issue over the last 12 years. But I don't know if any of you watched on CNN, they had a history of Jerusalem they're showing. Anyone see that mini-series on Jerusalem? It's been at 10 o'clock on Sunday nights. I watched the first one for about 20 minutes, and I said to myself, I know this. Right, yeah, I'm aware of this history. I don't need this again. So I stopped watching it. I watched the second one. They were going through the story of David and Goliath. And I said, I'm familiar with the story. I don't need this, So, but I opened up by saying, do you want the history from Obama or back to King Solomon? And what they say in the introduction to the show on CNN is, one of the professors who they have talking, one of the experts, she says, if you don't know the history going all the way back, and you think you can understand what's going on today, you can't. You can't understand the history of what's going on today by just looking at what's going on today. Now, if I just looked at what's going on today, before I tell you what is Palestine, if I just looked at what's going on today, I might also have some issues with Israel. Because I see that the Palestinians live in Gaza. Gaza is not a good place. You wouldn't want to live there. It's too crowded. You know what Gaza's like? If you ever go to lunch at Roasters and Toasters and try to find a parking spot, like at lunchtime, that's what it's like to live in Gaza all the time. Maybe not as bad. You drive around like 47 times, you get in 3 fights, you bump your car 6 times, and then you say, you know what, I'm just going to go to McDonald's, right? Because you can't get a spot to go to Roasters. All right, I don't. By the way, I'm not taking any more meetings at Roasters. You can't get a spot. So, with Gaza, it's overcrowded. It's controlled by Hamas, which is the same as being controlled by like the Nazis. I mean, they're that evil. The way they run the place. The West Bank, the movement of the Palestinians is restricted. There is a security barrier. There is only so prosperous they could be. And although some of their cities are nice, They don't have the same kind of services that you would have in Israel. They don't really have any freedom because the Palestinian Authority is a dictatorship. I mean, there's no freedom of the press. If you're gay, they kill you. There's no freedom of assembly. There's no freedom of government. There's no freedom. And so you could look at that and say, it's a group of people that has no nation. They have no say in anything. And Israel, which is right next door, is doing really great. And so, you might say, yeah, I understand. Israel's this aggressor with one of the greatest armies in the world, one of the eighth strongest country in the whole world. And the Palestinians are these tiny 2 little strips of land, and they don't have self-control over everything. And you look at it and say, yeah, I have to tell you, the Palestinian cause, I'm sympathetic to that. And they can't go back and forth and see their relatives in Gaza, and they can't go to Jerusalem and daven and pray, whatever they do, whenever they want. They can't trade goods with other nations whenever they want. They don't have an airport. They can't really have an army, even though they're the most armed group of people in the world, but they don't really have an army. And so you could say, I understand why that's a problem. So the question isn't today, what is the life like for the Palestinians? The question is why? And who has the power to do something about it? So, first of all, the word Palestine, does anyone know where this word comes from? Good. The Plishtim, the Philistines. Who was the famous Philistine? Goliath. David went out and fought Goliath. Goliath was a Philistine. The Philistines were the people who were like the biggest thorn in the side of the Jews in the ancient Near East. They were, if you read through the books of the Tanakh, they're always fighting with the Palestinians. I'm sorry, that's today. They're always fighting with the Philistines, the Plishtim. Why? Because they were rivals. So when the Romans kicked the Jews out, now they destroyed the Holy Temple in 70 CE, but they didn't kick the Jews out for another 50 years after the Jews revolted with the Bar Kokhba revolt. And so now the Romans were really mad at the Jews for having the audacity to stage a revolt. And so now they're going to kick all the Jews out of the land of Israel, and there were no Jews left. They kicked all of them out, and they changed the name to the name of the people that the Jews hated the most, besides the Romans, the Philistines. And they called the place Palestina, or Palestine, as an insult to the Jewish people. Now, who was living there at the time? Canaanites and Jews, and Romans. There were no Arabs. The term Arab didn't exist yet. There were no Muslims. Muhammad wouldn't be born for another 470 years. So who was there? What was the land? The land was the homeland of the Jewish people that they took over after their wars with the Canaanites. Okay, so if you want to say those were the ancient Canaanites lived, that's true. But where did those Canaanites come from? Those Canaanites were people who came generally from northern Africa. Who was the first ones who really had a homeland there? The Jewish people that actually had a nation there. Okay, so now we're kicked out. The Palestinians, this isn't a term that is used to refer to Arabs until the 60s. If you ask Golda Meir between 1921 and 1947, where are you from? What are you? She would say, I'm a Palestinian. I live in Palestine. When Jews in Europe were trying to get out of Europe to go to Israel, they didn't say we want to get out and go to Israel. We want to say we want to go to Palestine. When the Germans were putting up signs saying Jews get out, they said Jews. That's a famous joke. In the 30s, the Germans said, hey Jews, get out of Germany and go to Palestine. Now they're saying get out of Palestine. Well, do you want us to go there or to get out of there? What they're telling you is, we don't want you anywhere because you're Jewish. Well, a Palestinian before 1948 referred to Jews. Now, one of the celebrity models who put on her Instagram a picture of the Palestinian soccer team in the early 40s, to show that there was a nation there before Israel. But if you zero in on it, you can see that the shirts in Hebrew say Maccabi Tel Aviv. It was the Jewish team. She thought Palestinian meant that there were Palestinian Arabs living there up until 1948, and they were the Palestinians. The soccer team was called, the Palestinian team was made up of all Jews. So who lived in Israel until 1948? Jews and Arabs. Not Jews, Arabs, and Palestinians. Jews and Arabs. Okay, now, what was the name of the land? If it was called Palestine, and if it always just was Palestine, shouldn't it be the land of the people who today are called the Palestinians? Well, the answer is no, it wasn't called Palestine. It was called the Mandatory British colony or settlement of Palestine. It was Mandatory Britain. It was controlled by the British. It wasn't controlled by the Palestinians at all. If you called the Arabs Palestinian at the time, they wouldn't know what you were referring to because the term didn't exist yet. In fact, they would think you were calling them Jewish. They didn't know. It didn't exist. So, what happened? If you want to go back further, go back further. The Turks were there. If the Turks controlled it for all those years, and the Palestinians say, well, they're from the Turks, well, just by being a Turk means this isn't your land. Go to Turkey. We'll pay for the trip, right? But if that's who you are, if that's what Palestine was before the British, if you're from the Turks, then go to Turkey. Well, what if you're not from the Turks? Well, then you're from the Byzantines, who were there before the Arabs. Are you Byzantine? No. Who was there before them? The Romans. Are you Roman? No. Who was there before them? Judea, the Jews. At no time in human history was the land of Israel as we know it today ever called Palestine. And it was only in the 60s when the people we call today the Palestinians adopted their flag and said, we are the Palestinians. This has always been our land. Now, had they been there for a long time? Sure. Nobody disputes that. And they used to live in places like Jaffa and Hebron and Haifa and Nazareth and so forth. So this is the first question. But now we have to ask, if you're asking this question, you have to say this. Why then all those Arabs who used to live in Hebron or who used to live in Haifa or still have the key to their house in Jaffa, why aren't they there? Why are they either in the West Bank or in Gaza? Why? Now, if I don't know anything about Israel, if I don't know anything about what's going on, what I say is, well, in 1948, Israel just kicked them out. Okay. Is that what happened? So let's ask the question, what really happened? Okay. So, Holocaust ends in 1945. In 1947, the British say, we don't love this situation. The Arabs are attacking us and they want us out. The Jews are attacking us and they want us out. And we're the referees between the Arabs and the Jews fighting with each other. We're leaving. And they left. Okay, so what did they do? Did they just give the land to the Jews? Absolutely not. In fact, during World War II, the British wouldn't allow hardly any Jews to come to Israel because they didn't want to upset the Arabs because they were afraid of losing oil and their relationship with the oil-rich countries. So they hardly let any of the survivors come. In fact, they took most of the survivors and put them in DP camps in places like Cyprus. If you watch the movie Exodus, that's where it starts. Right? Okay. So how did all of those Arabs who used to live in Jaffa and had beautiful homes in Haifa, why are they stuck in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip today? Well, the United Nations, the whole world, made a decision. Now remember, the whole world just finished annihilating the Jews. There's not a whole lot of love for the Jews in human history. But nevertheless, the whole world decides we're going to create a partition. The Jews will live where they live, and the Arabs will live where they live. And 3/5 of the land, by the way, went to a country called Jordan. Jordan took most of it. The entire West Bank went to Jordan. The entire Gaza Strip was part of Egypt. And what was left, what was divided up, the Arabs who were living in their beautiful homes in Jaffa and Haifa, they were there. And the Jews said, no problem. You Arabs stay where you are. We Jews will stay where we are. We reach out, David Ben-Gurion, the Declaration of Independence. We send our hand out in peace to all the surrounding countries, and everything's great. Everyone is in their home. The next day, Declaration of Independence, every Arab nation, all 4 zillion of them, attack Israel with everything they have. The king of Iraq says, we're coming to slaughter the Jews. It's in the newspaper. It's going to be another Holocaust. We're going to kill them all. Please, Dahlia. It's okay. I know, it's annoying. Okay. So, the Arabs attack. The Jews have 2 choices. Fight back or be slaughtered. And their first reaction is, we've tried being slaughtered. That was not enjoyable. We're going to fight back. So, you start fighting back. Did the Jews want the war? Of course not. They thought they were going to be destroyed. Who wants all these Arab nations to come in and attack this tiny army of Holocaust survivors and refugees from Arab countries? Nevertheless, after a year, they win the War of Independence, and in the war, certain things had to happen, like when you're fighting a war and the Arabs are coming and Arabs live there, you have to move the Arabs out of those areas. Well, the other Arab countries came and said to these people, we're going to come in, we're going to kill all the Jews, and then you'll take your land. And they said, okay, great. And they went on vacation, and they came back, and they saw they lost. And you can't come back. So they ended up in refugee camps or in the West Bank, which was Jordan, or in Jordan, and eventually to the Gaza Strip as well. Okay. So this question of, you kicked us all off of our land, and that's what a lot of the lies are. The reason that I'm not in my home in Jaffa is because you kicked us out. Not really. Actually, not at all. But if you don't know that whole history, that there never was a Palestine, and when they had a chance to have their own Palestine, we said, we'd rather have war and slaughter all the Jews instead, well, that was a big mistake. And they're still paying for it. But to let the Arabs come back and take those houses, after the Jews needed them in order to defend themselves, that's what you call a consequence of war. And wars have serious consequences. Now, is everything that happens in a war so wonderful? No. Were there cases where sometimes the Jews made mistakes and killed a whole bunch of Arabs that they should have? Probably. But those are minor, tiny incidents in the broader picture. And by the way, it happened on the other side too. There's plenty of terror coming from the other side. Okay, so that's what is Palestine. Now let's talk about the Temple Mount. When did Arab terror against the Jews start in Palestine? Really in the 20s. Okay, now the first nationalistic leader of the Arabs who lived in Palestine was Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. He was a friend of Hitler. There are pictures of him in Germany, meeting with Hitler. What do you think they were talking about? Backgammon strategy? They're talking about how do you kill Jews. They're talking about how to kill Jews. And a lot of the early roots and structure of the Palestinian people were brought up from the ideology of Haj Amin al-Husseini, who sympathized with the Nazis and who wanted to remove and kill the Jews who were living in his area. And so this is who the Jews were dealing with. Now, this is in the 20s and 30s. In the 20s and 30s, there are no settlements. There's a few kibbutzes. There's nascent Tel Aviv, the Jewish quarter in Jerusalem. Tiny little enclaves of Jews trying to farm the land. What was there also? Arab terror. There were pogroms in 1922, in 1929, in Hebron, where Jews were massacred. For what? Why would there have been pogroms in the 20s and 30s when Israel didn't even exist? There's no settlements. The Jews have no claim to the Temple Mount. All they're doing is, there were terrorist attacks and riots because Jews were not welcome, for the very fact that there were Jews. Now, you had lots of different types of Arabs, and sometimes they fight with each other, to be fair, more so today than back then. But when Egypt was ruling the Gaza Strip, how often did the Palestinians revolt against Egypt? Never. Why? Because they would be massacred. They tried it with Jordan. What happened? You ever hear Black September? They were massacred. Any nation who had a terrorist group like this continuing to incite would be wiped out. The only one nation who can't, because they're held to a different standard, and that's Israel. Okay, so the Temple Mount today, one of the lies that is told is that the Jews have been trying to conquer and destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is the mosque on the Temple Mount. And this claim has been made since the 20s. Now, Israel has only had control of that area since 1967. And we continue to hear in this last war, there were riots on the Temple Mount, and the war started with Hamas sending a rocket into Jerusalem to protect the Temple Mount. So the question you could ask is, and what we're trying to do is debunk these lies. And so we started by debunking the lie that the Palestinians were always there and it was always their nation, when there's no such thing. And if there was a Palestine, it was Jews, not Arabs. But there wasn't. So the second lie we need to debunk is that the Jews are trying to destroy the Temple Mount. So here's the question you have to ask. If the Jews are trying to destroy the Temple Mount, and the Jews have had control of that area since 1967, how come the Temple Mount is still there? If they wanted to destroy it, they would destroy it. Not only do they not destroy it, but they've given the Palestinians the right to govern what goes on there. And last year alone, there were 3.5 million visits of Arabs to pray on the Temple Mount and 12,000 visits of Jews. And Jews aren't allowed to pray there. They're only allowed to go and walk around, and only at certain times. The Temple Mount is in control of the Palestinians. And the Jordanians watch over it like a hawk. And if the Israelis ever do anything, like try to protect themselves up there, the Jordanians go crazy. So this myth that the Jews are out to destroy Al-Aqsa, that they've been proclaiming since the 20s, has never happened. And there's no reason to think that it will. But still, large segments of the world think that it's a goal of the Jews to go and destroy Al-Aqsa. And it's not. The name of Yasser Arafat's terrorist organization was the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade. They were martyrs for Al-Aqsa. Talk about dying for nothing. Nobody's even trying to get it, and they're dying for it. But this is part of the propaganda ideology that they've created that is based on complete and utter falsehoods. There's not one Israeli that cares about Al-Aqsa. There's not one Israeli that wants to destroy Al-Aqsa. Even the ultra-Orthodox couldn't care less, because it's the belief in Judaism that when the third temple comes, God's just going to bring it and it's going to come down and smash the mosque. Why should we waste our time? God's going to smash it eventually anyway. So, look, is there a novel written every once in a while about some crazy Orthodox Jew who wants to go and blow up the Al-Aqsa Mosque? Yes. Does the state of Israel ever allow that to happen? No. If they did, it would be gone. It's still there, and no one's ever laid a finger on it. Okay. Now, the settlements are a fun one. I started off with a couple easy ones. Any questions so far? Is it clear? Sure? Okay. Settlements. Now, if it wasn't for Israel, politically, I guess I would probably be your run-of-the-mill, maybe slightly right-of-center Reform rabbi. But because of Israel, I'm like this right-wing radical, in the Reform movement, because I support Israel to the hilt. And a lot of rabbis do, but I'm a little more hawkish on Israel than most Reform rabbis. And I'm not shy about it, although I'm liberal on pretty much everything else, except Iran. Okay, so the settlements, we've pointed out, first of all, before 1967, there's no such thing as settlements. Because the land is Jordan, there's not one Jew who lives there. And the Gaza Strip is Egypt, there's not one Jew who lives there before 1967. After 1967, you know what the peace of 1967 was? We'll take a piece of this, and we'll take a piece of that, and we'll take a piece of this, right? Because they took the Golan Heights from Syria, and they took the West Bank from Jordan, and they took the Gaza Strip from Egypt, they took the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, so it's a joke. It's a play on words. Peace. All right, forget it. It's not for everyone. It's better in Hebrew. So now you have Jews who say, for two reasons, we want to move into the West Bank. One, that's Jewish land. And two, maybe a little bit lesser so, but two, for security reasons, to create a buffer between the Palestinian cities and Jerusalem and the outskirts of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv on the other side. So, what is a settlement? The Palestinian myth of the settlements is that the Jews went to these Palestinian towns, destroyed everything, and then built their city on top of it. That has never happened. That is a myth that is proclaimed all the time and has never happened. What did the Jews do? So, by the way, why? First of all, what is the West Bank? The West Bank is what is geographically called Judea and Samaria. I once saw an interview where a foreign press journalist asked Netanyahu, how could the Jews have a right to build in Judea? And Netanyahu said, it's called Judea. How can you tell us we don't live in Judea? By the way, this is great. If you ever meet someone from Temple, Judea, who doesn't support the settlers, how could you believe it? How could you go to this temple? I see Rabbi Siegel is a good friend of mine. I say, how are things going at Temple West Bank? But, okay. I mean, it's a funny name if you don't support the settlers, but all right, whatever. So what happened was the Jews saw these areas where no one was living and where no one had ever lived. And they started building neighborhoods. And they started growing and growing. And today, they're less than 500,000 of the 7 million Jews who live in Israel, 6.5 million Jews who live in Israel, but it's formidable. Now, here's what happens to these settlements. Sure, they're provocative, because every time you eat up a little bit of that land, the Palestinians see that as when they finally do get their state in that land, they'll have less land, and there'll be Jews there, and they don't want either of those two things. And so that sounds provocative until you understand what Israel's done in the past. So if you say, would Israel uproot those Jews and move them? Sure, do it all the time. We gave back the entire Sinai Peninsula and uprooted all the Jews who were living there. We gave back the entire Gaza Strip and uprooted all the Jews who were living there. Ehud Barak offered 97% of the West Bank to Arafat. And Arafat accepted it as part of the Oslo Accords. But when the Oslo Accords were, he took the Nobel Peace Prize for it. But when he went to sell it afterwards, he couldn't sell it. Now, why couldn't he sell it? Because Hamas was saying, on the other hand, he'll get you 97% of the West Bank. Hamas, what we stand for, is getting you 100% of all of Israel. So you want to go with his 90% of that slice of land, or do you want to go with us? We're going to get you the whole thing. And Arafat says, if I make this deal, they'll kill me. And he turned on the deal and started the Second Intifada instead. But Israel has shown, and Prime Minister Omer also offered the land again. Israel has shown twice that they would uproot the settlers and give all the land back to the Palestinians if they would just settle on peace. So, if you're going to say that settlements are the reason why Palestinians turn to terror, which is what they say often, that this was so provocative that they had nowhere else to turn, then you have to ask yourself, was there Palestinian terror before 1967? And when the answer is yeah, there was tons of it, how do you deal with this with a straight face? If you're saying this is where terror started, why was there so much terror before anyone put a shovel in the ground? The terror goes back to the 20s. What was Haj Amin al-Husseini talking about with Hitler? Was he trying to convince Hitler that the Jews weren't so bad? I mean, for real. So, yes, it's provocative. But consider this. There's an area called Ramat Shlomo. Ramat Shlomo is a forest on the outskirts of Jerusalem and is in the West Bank. When Biden was vice president, he went to Israel. And right before he left, Netanyahu sort of needled him a little bit, said, we're developing more apartments in Ramat Shlomo. Okay. Now, Ramat Shlomo was before it's literally connected to Jerusalem. And before they built this settlement there, it was a forest. No one in the history of the world had ever had a neighborhood in that area. And the Jews cleared the forest and they built a little neighborhood of Orthodox Jews. Now, one thing Orthodox Jews have a lot of is kids. And the one thing those kids want is to live by their parents. So what happens? In order to live by their parents, you need to build more apartments in that neighborhood. So, I mean, this is how ridiculous it was. I mean, this was an international incident. Biden went crazy and started blasting Netanyahu. How can you build in the West Bank while I'm here? So, if this is Jerusalem, Ramat Shlomo's here. There's not an Arab that lives anywhere near here. It's an ultra Orthodox area. So, Netanyahu says, we're going to allow them to build 9 more apartments right here. Really? That's land that the Palestinians wanted? I mean, it would be like saying, Orlando should be part of Puerto Rico. I mean, it's just ridiculous. There's no way any Palestinian would ever live here. It's a completely ultra-Orthodox neighborhood, and there's people who need some apartments in the neighborhood. But to build neighborhoods in this already completely Jewish apartment, in this already completely Jewish area, was building settlements in the West Bank and taking away land from the Palestinians. Land, by the way, that was offered back twice and rejected. So if you're going to say this is the reason that the settlers are the reason why the Palestinians have such a miserable life, why didn't they accept the deal twice to take back 97% of the land and kick the Jews out and have their own state there? And the answer is because Arafat couldn't sell it, because if he sold it, he would have been killed, because the Palestinians want everything, not just the West Bank. Okay. BDS. Ben and Jerry's. Okay. So BDS stands for Boycott, Divest, and Sanction. And these two go along together. Actually, maybe let's talk about Gaza first. And then we'll finish with these two, and hopefully that will wrap up a lot of the questions that emerged from the last war. And then if there's any questions, we can take those. Now, if you just look at the facts on the ground today, Gaza does look really bad. I wouldn't want to live in Gaza. I wouldn't want any of you to live in Gaza. Maybe a couple of you. No, but it's a place where the conditions are bad. And we admit that. The question is why? So if you were a Jew who lived on the border of, the southern border on what's called Otef Aza, the Gaza envelope, the Jewish ring of communities that surround Gaza, and you lived there in the 70s and 80s, you would have been accustomed to going into Gaza for dinner, to go fishing. People went back and forth all the time. It wasn't dangerous. Until the first Intifada and the birth of Hamas. And then slowly it became very dangerous. And Jews obviously couldn't go around, and they built a blockade around it. Now, why did they have to build a fence around Gaza? Because of the terror. For the same reason that they had to build a security wall around the West Bank, because of the Second Intifada. When they built the security fence, the Second Intifada stopped because they couldn't come in and bomb anymore. So the walls worked. The problem is, if you're stuck inside, your life's miserable. So there's one way to defeat the blockade. The Palestinians think there are a number of ways to beat the blockade. They would prefer to convince professors at NYU and Cornell to bash Israel to the point where Israel can't take it anymore in the international arena and at the UN, and Israel will just take down the wall. The reason Israel won't do that is because then floods of terrorists will continue to come in and attack Israel and kill Israelis. But the one way that the Palestinians could actually get the wall taken down is to demilitarize. So you know the famous expression that the day that the Arabs drop their weapons, there'll be peace. The day that the Jews drop their weapons, there'll be no more Jews. That's a fact. That's a fact. So if Hamas would go out of business, and if they would demilitarize, then sure, they could get the blockade removed. But until then, that's a consequence of war. If you're going to threaten us, we're going to protect ourselves. That's how war or a state of war works. And, what I'm telling you in most of the lies, I don't know what percentage of Palestinians hate Hamas. And they'll all tell you that they do, but they don't. because the last election that was going to be held right before the war was canceled by Abbas. And the reason it was canceled is because he knew he was going to lose. And who was he going to lose to? Hamas. Well, if he was going to lose to Hamas in the election, it must mean that a lot of Palestinians are voting for Hamas. So Hamas represents terror. Now, Hamas had an underground tunnel system which was larger than London's underground tunnel system, apparently. You know what it takes to build that? Millions upon millions upon millions of dollars. On top of the ground, there are not many schools. The hospitals aren't very good. They could be. They could be the best in the world. Iran and Qatar and all these people Europe, people will rush to pour money into Gaza if they're willing to build for their own people. They could have had Singapore, but they chose Beirut. And so that's what they have. So yes, if someone tells you, how could Israel keep Gaza in this open air prison? It's because it's too dangerous not to. Because if we don't, then all the innocent Israelis will be slaughtered. But you get rid of Hamas and you get rid of all the weapons, the walls could come down tomorrow. So that's a little bit about what's going on with Hamas. Now, the Palestinians, they can't win militarily. Even with all the help from Iran, even with all the money from Qatar, they're even now starting to be abandoned by former friends. And that's because the Sunni world is afraid of Iran and recognizes in Israel a partner, not just in fighting Iran, but also in terms of agriculture, science, medicine, and so forth. So these other countries that hated Israel more than anyone could hate anything, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, Oman, Sudan, Morocco. And Morocco isn't so bad, but those other states are pretty bad. They now have relations with Israel. And the Palestinians are losing their trump card. Their trump card, not political Trump, but just in terms of playing cards. Their trump card was Israel can never have normalized relationships with the Arab world until they first make an accord with the Palestinians. And the Israelis said, it's not true anymore. That kills the Palestinians. So the only thing left to do is to try in the international diplomatic arena to get the rest of the world to pressure Israel to give in. And that has resulted in what we see on the progressive left, who were ripe for it because of all the stuff that happened with Netanyahu. Now, if I were the president of the Reform movement, see, the Reform movement at the top leadership is super liberal. And they have a great track record for that. Tikkun Olam, social action, social justice, is all they ever talk about. They could have played a key role in reaching out to these progressives whose language they speak on every other issue and get them to support Israel. But they haven't done it. And I think in a lot of ways they haven't done it because they didn't agree with Netanyahu on virtually anything. My position was, who cares if you like Netanyahu, do it to support Israel. And it hasn't really happened. I mean, maybe a little bit, but it hasn't really happened. Yeah. Well, not so much Biden. They'll do it now that Netanyahu's not in office. So, I hope. But I haven't seen much reaching out to them. And some of them are gone. You can't even talk to them. Some of them are lost. And if you would try to tell them all the stuff that I've said so far, they'd tell me, that's fake news. You're making that up. Because the truth doesn't interest them. The truth is a battle they can't win. So their own Palestinian narrative that is based on one lie after another, which I've tried to point out, is their Bible. And whatever I'm saying, no matter how much truth it might be, don't take my word for it. Anything I said, go research it. But they'll say that's fake news. You're making that up. That's how Jews are. That kind of stuff. Okay. Now, these are the people who say, we love Jews, we hate Israel. And so the question you have to ask them, and, the squad and those types of people, if you don't mind Jews, and you're only against Israel, or you're Ben and Jerry's and now you won't serve ice cream in the West Bank, why do you sell ice cream to the Philippines? Why can't I get your ice cream in China? China has concentration camps for the Muslim Uyghurs or Uyghurs, whatever they're called. They have concentration camps. Other countries have concentration camps. Other countries just kill their people for no reason. The guy who just became president of Iran killed 30,000 people. But they're only hyper-focused on Israel. This has become their issue. And the reason why is because the Palestinians are very good at, what's the word? Oh, I forget the word. There's a word when you get someone who has another cause to see that their cause is the same as your cause. And I'm blanking on the word. Intersectionality. Thank you. Toda. They're very good at intersectionality. So what happens is they'll go to the lesbian group and say, your struggle is our struggle. And so a group of women come to the Dyke March, and they bring a flag that's the rainbow flag, and it has a Jewish star on it. And they said, you're not welcome here. Why not? We're Jews. And we're lesbians. That star is offensive because it reminds people of Israel, you have to leave. What? There's only one country in the Middle East where it's legal to be a lesbian. You get killed in any of the other countries. So why would the people, the organizers of that march, be sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, where in the Palestinian territories you get the death penalty for being gay, and in Israel it's one of the leaders in the world in gay rights? Because their people have gotten to them and convinced them that just like you're oppressed, we're oppressed. And they've done it across the map of left-wing causes in America, including this idea that, and this is really the way to put it, that every Palestinian is George Floyd, and every Israeli is the cop who killed him. And that's the picture that they've portrayed, as opposed to saying, what really are these issues? Why did this really happen? And so that's why this progressive cause has taken up the idea. Now, the one problem that we have, well, we have thousands of problems, but one other problem that we have that is a real problem is that Reform Judaism, and anything left of that, I guess, has become ultra-progressive at the leadership level. And so the Jews who are growing up in this world, where they're on Instagram and they're seeing this stuff, where they're in their schools that are much more progressive, because we're talking about Jews. I'm not, you say, well, in Mississippi it's not that progressive. Yeah, but there's only one Jew there, right? And he can't wait to leave, But in places where Jews are, right, like Los Angeles and Boston and, whatever, the teachers are more progressive. And they also are interested in the underdog. And they might think that by supporting the Palestinians, just like I grew up thinking that the Afrikaners were evil and the blacks in South Africa were rightfully the oppressed, and I was right about that, they grow up thinking the same thing about Palestinians, not knowing any of what we know. And when Jews go to their synagogues and hear their rabbis saying similar things and really far leftist things like that. And when they go to their college campuses and they're inundated with it because the Palestinians are very effective on the college campuses and we're struggling to keep up and they outnumber us and they're committed to it, then we have to ask the question, what is going on here? And of course, the final point that I'll make is that the obsessiveness by which these people attack Israel, and groups like J Street, which this is maybe the one controversial thing that I'll say. I'm not a fan of J Street. A lot of Jews are. A lot of rabbis are. But they espouse beliefs that will say everything that I'm telling you is fake news. And they'll say these people are evil. And I disagree. But our kids are hearing their message. And they're buying it. And they're turning on Israel. And that to me is really, really scary. Okay. So, I guess that's it. I think in a nutshell, those are pretty much all the lies I could think of to debunk. So I'm very interested in any reaction, any questions, any comments, whatever. But thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. So, okay. Okay. Oh yeah, take the mic. Sorry. You have to flip it on and start over.
Okay, do certain things have a cycle? For instance, I noticed that over the last several years, more Asian countries are pro-Israel, and not just the technology, but just the whole idea of what they really stand for. And if you really watched this Olympics, this was the first time that they took a moment of silence for the Israeli athletes that were killed by Black September.
Well, they're the only part of the world, really, pretty much, that has no anti-Semitic track record. Anti-Semitism doesn't interest them. It's not their thing. There's no Islam, there's no Christianity. They're not anti-Semitic. They look at Jews just like they would any other people. And so there's a great thing. The problem is China. The problem is China, and China is an enemy of Israel, just like Russia is a huge problem, because they see Israel as an extension of the United States, and they hate the United States, which makes Israel part of their enemies. And the only place that it truly matters is Russia and China continuing to prop up Iran. And that's a horrible situation. But other than that, they're doing a tremendous amount of business in all sorts of fields, including medicine, with Israel. And that's fabulous. And Netanyahu was a great, friend maker in as many areas as he could. So hopefully it will continue. Although China's a real problem. China's very scary. So, and the Israelis are scared of it, from what I hear. Is it on? It should be green. Green. There you go.
How do we go about convincing places like college when you have this mass amount of people that believe anything nowadays, get riled up that we're doing bad things to the Palestinians? The Palestinians, poor Palestinians, aren't living well. And then you have the Squad of Four, which I'm not going to get into. But they are, in fact, part of the House of Representatives, and they are spewing out all this stuff, including my own university, where there's a lot of Jewish money going in that has supported Columbia for years and years. And yet, I really resent that. Well, I resent the university shutting down anyone who has, quote, free speech, which means if you don't agree with me, you're out.
I think there's two answers. Now I'm forgetting one of them. one answer, well, okay, there's two answers. The first answer is dialogue. 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 We would do better to sit down with these detractors and try to find common ground. I don't believe that all of them are horrible people. You have to ask a few questions. Do you support Hamas? If they say yes, there's nothing to talk about. But if they say, a lot of them will say, I hate Hamas. I hate Israel, but I hate Hamas. You hate Hamas? Let's talk. Let me explain to you some of this and show this to you from our perspective and see if we can find common ground. Usually, if you're talking with a rational person, you can have a dialogue and start to make inroads and have good conversations. It's possible. It happened at Oslo. It can happen. And then what you need to do is talk about what is it going to take for the next this generation's done. It's not going to be peace this generation. But what's it going to take for the next generation to grow up willing to have dialogue? Now, the answer may be never. They've already come to the realization that Jews and Palestinians will never live together, at least not for hundreds of years. But they could separate from each other. Can we separate peacefully? You guys live here, we'll live here, and that's it. We won't fight. That's the goal. The goal isn't to be good friends anymore. We'll give up on that. But can we separate? And is there enough incentive? Can the world provide enough incentive for everybody to do that? Now, I would have said several years ago, no, but with the Sunnis coming on board with Israel, it's a major blow. The Palestinians have very few friends left. Hamas is mostly Sunni. They're mostly Sunni, but Saudi Arabia doesn't care for them. Iran and Qatar and Yemen and Libya is pretty much all they have left. But it doesn't matter as long as they have Iran. Iran is the menace of the neighborhood, and they're the ones who keep it going. So the first thing is dialogue, which we need to do, and try to get to the next generation. But the second thing is we need to fight better on social media. And I promise you the next war, the Israelis will be better because they learned that lesson. And I think that they're going to have a warehouse somewhere in Israel with 12, geeky kids from Tel Aviv programming millions of bots to go on Instagram and flood it with pro-Israel stuff. So, but we need to fight better online as well. Yes?
What organizations can we support to get your message out there?
Well, the Rabbi Barras Discretionary Fund is one that, if you really want to make a difference. Yeah. What a great question. So AIPAC. I can't tell you how important AIPAC is. There's nobody else that is really doing the work to create bipartisan support for Israel. And people say, look, when I was in Fort Myers, they said, how can you talk to AIPAC? They're too liberal. And when I'm here, they say, how can you talk to AIPAC? They're too conservative. It's nonsense. They're right down the middle. They're working with every single elected official to support Israel. So AIPAC's really, really important. I love JNF. I think they're supporting great programs in Israel, Jewish National Fund. I support the FIDF, the Friends of the IDF. They do really good stuff. These soldiers have tough lives, and they make them a lot easier. And when you go to Israel, you see all the things that they do for the soldiers. Magen David Adom is really important. The reason why Magen David Adom is so important is besides all the ambulances and all that, no country will sell blood to Israel except for the United States, because that blood could go to Israeli soldiers. And so blood for Israel is really hard to get, and they need money to buy it to make sure that they have a blood supply. So Magen David Adom takes care of all that, and they're They're extremely, extremely important. Who else do I like? AJC. AJC is doing more on the diplomatic front internationally to support Israel and to fight anti-Semitism. So I'm on their board. I support them. So. Did you have a...
To go off on a side note, when you have your rabbinical conclaves,
Yeah.
especially in the Reform movement, do people, rabbis like you, get up and talk so some of the other ones are not part of this progressive movement, or they get to understand the history better or what you're doing to our young people?
Honestly, they deftly avoid it. And you know what they talk about? They talk about how do we support the Reform movement in Israel? How do we make it so that Reform Jews can pray at the Western Wall? Those kinds of issues, which are important. But to me, and I'm on their board, I'm actually on their national board too. But I'm more, if you ask me what's more important, well, I mean, if you ask me what's more important, that Jews should be able to daven at the Western Wall with women, or that Iran doesn't get nuclear weapons, right? So I'd rather talk about Iran right now. That doesn't mean that it's not important. What the ultra-Orthodox are doing in Israel is a shanda, and we need to fight it with everything we can. But I also want to talk about how do we get Congress to make sure that Iran never gets a nuclear weapon, and they don't talk about that. I'll tell you, most rabbis support Israel, maybe not in the way that I do, but are supportive of Israel. However, the newer generations, every new generation becomes more and more critical of Israel. And that's what scares me. It scares me a lot. Yeah.
So you joked, I guess, about nerds and making bots and influencing, but Israel is a really smart, progressive country. Why aren't there more social media influencers?
They don't,
More PR coming out of Israel?
because they don't really care that much about what's going on in America. And if there's anti-Semitism here, their general feeling is, well, why don't you move to Israel? They don't understand why we're here. If you don't like it there, just come here. You don't have to worry about that. Honestly, that's how they feel. And they have some right to do that. Because why should they care about our feelings when, some crazy model is saying, I don't like Israel, when they have 4,000 rockets falling on their head? They say, I'm terribly sorry that Bella Hadid doesn't like you guys, but I'm a little busy dodging rockets right now. That being said, this last war was a wake-up call. And I think they'll do better next time. At least I hope so. So when I was there in June, we met with a company that's called Vibe Israel that's working on it. Working on promoting Israel as a more positive force online. So instead of seeing rockets falling on Israel, you see, tweets and things of Israel providing vaccines to countries in Africa, and stuff like that. The stuff that they really do. So, it's good questions. Okay, other questions? Any other lies we didn't debunk? Okay, good start. All right, thank you all very much. I hope that helped a little.